Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and today we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about, but I like to think that I'm talking to you, so I'll say we all the time. Chapters 5 and 6 of Their Eyes Are Watching God, and there's a lot there. It's taken me actually a little longer than I thought to go back and reread and think about what you could do with these chapters, because there is a lot there. To start with, you have Janie gets married very quickly to Joe Sharks, and she's thinking that this new life is going to be what she originally dreamed about. So that pear tree scene is actually kind of the beginning of her ideas about love. But when the fantasy becomes a reality, as this is more than not, I think, often the case, reality is always different than what we think something could be. Because, hopefully you'll mention this in an essay maybe, and know just enough about Lacan and the idea of desire. All you really have to remember in order to use that is to remember that desire is always out there. And so is infatuation in a way. Infatuation is an idea of somebody. Usually, when people fall in love quickly and they get married and then the marriage falls apart, they will say things like, well, it's not the person I thought. Well, you didn't probably spend enough time getting to know that person, especially when you're living in the same house and you have, to deal with your money and finances and everything together. It becomes very different. And so the way she describes it, again, this is very poetic language. It's not saying exactly what he's doing, but it's telling that there's not an intimacy. For her to say that there was no rhymes in the way that he talked. He's on the train the next day. Joe didn't make speeches with rhymes to her, and that rhyme is sort of symbolic of the intimate, poetic language, which is more feminine. It's more associated with a way of communicating with it, like a child or a spouse or something that has a connection. Sometimes people say that people have a chemistry, and you can see it even like on screen. You can see certain people can be together, or you meet somebody and you think, I could really be friends with this person, and then you might meet another person and you think, there's no way she and I would mix. We're like oil and water. But in this case, it's obvious he doesn't have that connection, that there's not really going to be that chemistry between them. But it's all very economic and practical. And coming from where she's coming from, this looks like a really good thing. This is materialism. This is what you want, right? This is everything anybody wants, is to have whatever they can have and be comfortable. So this is the next stage of discovering who she is. It comes with kind of an economic reality about, and not just about herself, but also about the community. Because what happens is Joe comes in, and it's about like what he thinks it's going to be. He thinks that it's going to be a town where nothing's happening. He asks, where's the mayor? Who tells you what to do? And they say, well, we're all grown here. We just survive. I mean, what else are you supposed to do? And Joe thinks, no, you have to thrive. This is not going to be, a successful town unless, you buy big. I'm going to buy some land. I'm going to get some more families here. And he has it all planned out. And, naturally, some people are going to be hesitant and maybe even jealous. The one conversation that they're having, when he says, one of the guys says, this is, he's liable to do it too, Hicks. I hope so anyhow. Us colored folks are too envious of one another. That's how come we don't get any further than we do. Us talks about white people keeping us down. Shucks, he don't have to. Us keep us ourselves down. And I think this is really kind of more Hurston's point of view. Even though you can definitely see that she's critical of what happens with Joe and what happens to the people, and I'm going to do it more and try to show you that in a Marxist lens. But as far as having leadership and having somebody come in who has money, and remember, Joe has been around white people, so he's watched them, and he knows like how that works, and it works in the beginning if you already have money. And this is what also is difficult when you get like, for instance, you'll start to see this when you get to college and Ivy League schools or whatever. A lot of times people get into those situations because they have the background, they have the money, or they had really educated parents. When you don't start like that, it's very hard to break through and and get, even though that we live in America and obviously you have the opportunity, it is still easier for others than it would be like if you came from nothing and you had parents who were, just real simple country folks or farmers or something like that, and you don't know. And I think you'll see in the text that is kind of revealed as we get there. For instance, Janie was astonished to see how the money Jody had spent on land came back to them so fast. So here he is as he's coming in, and of course he's making it out to be more about the community, and in a way I think he does care. He wants things like a lamppost out. Nobody could think of that because they've never seen it. They never had it. They haven't lived in the kind of place that Joe comes from. But now they start to see that there's possibility that they could, first you could do this. You could get a post office, which of course you're going to need a mayor and someone to tell you what to do. And he doesn't say anything, but he naturally gets elected to do that once they have their first town meeting. I also should mention that the first town meeting, the first thing that he says is we have to get the men folks together to form a committee. So you start to see, the tradition when you ask why are there double standards with men and women? Where does this come from? I think it comes naturally from a tradition that this is the way it is. And if that's the way it's been, then it's hard to say, well, why does it have to be that way? You have to get somebody who's willing to question the authority. So Janie kind of gets there too, is that's part of, I think, her maturity, or maybe even like her identity moving into essence. Because really in the end, the essence is not what your society or what people think you should be, or you're not, like everybody else. The essence is the heroic qualities in you that sometimes never come out. It depends. It depends on how courageous you are with your life, I guess. But at any rate, so Janie sees that he makes the money back very quickly, and he is benefiting, even though he's getting a store that seems to be benefiting everybody else. He's making a profit off these people. And before I lose this thought, even though this is at the end of the chapter, I want to go ahead and say this just so you can see it as we lead up to this thought. After someone else was being, at the very end, when someone was being critical of him about, someone trying to run off with his ribbon cane, he made him leave town. And some folks thought that Sharks ought not have done that. He had so much cane and everything else, why did he care? But they didn't say that while Joe Sharks was on the porch. When the mail came from Maitland, he went inside and he started to sort it out. So then they start to have a conversation about this. And they said, well, I don't care. Colored folks be that hard on one another. We need to have some sympathy. And someone says, no, we don't. I don't see it that way at all, says Sam Watson. Let colored folks learn to work for what they get like everybody else. Nobody ain't stopped Pitts from planting the cane he wanted to, and Sharks gave him a job. What more does he want? He says, I know that too, Jones says, but Sam, Joe Sharks is too exact with folks. And again, we're looking at exact is to mean a lot more, too forward, too sharp. And in a way, what we want to get to with a Marxist lens is that the rich exploits the poor. And one way to think about this is to think back to when people worked during an industrial revolution and people were working in factories. How were they treated? What were their hours like? What about child labor? Now, somebody was benefiting from all of this and becoming very wealthy. And under, a capitalist ideal, absolutely has the right. He's the one that got it started. He's the one that had the money in the first place. But when you think about like the children, forced labor, why? Because kids can't speak for themselves. And you go back and you think about, what does Joe want to be? He wants to be a big voice. The most vulnerable people are the ones who are silenced. And I think we see a lot of this coming out, especially in terms of abuse. Children are very vulnerable to be abused because they are not going to have the confidence and the knowledge and the education and the maturity to tell an adult this is wrong. So they repress it and they don't say anything until years later. And I think the same thing kind of happens to women. And this is why when people say, well, why didn't they say something 10 years ago? Because they didn't have the power of language. That takes an education, it takes maturity. And when you don't question it, and you don't feel like you can question authority, you think, well, whoever's doing this is more powerful than me, then you stay oppressed. That's how you oppress people, is you silence them. And so look at what he says about this observation about Joe. He says that all he got, he done made off the rest of us. He didn't have all that when he came here. See, so he had some money. He quickly made more money and more money. And is also getting the community. There's even one point where they brought up slavery to Joe Sharks. They all did it. And it was for the good of the community, but there's definitely some resentment there, and I think that they can't articulate it exactly what's happening because they don't know any different, and the class systems kind of stay where they're at because they don't know any better. So that I'm going to go back and try to lead up to that point again, but I want you to see where I'm headed with this so that you can understand, well, what does it mean to exploit? So he makes his money back, and what is her role in all of this as the mayor's wife? You notice that he immediately starts to isolate her from the community. He sets her apart, and he wants to make sure, like when the town gets together, that she has the best. She's the bell cow, is what he calls her, a bell cow. She's got to be the one who, looks the best, and the other women have to be envious of her. And the men have to be envious because she belongs to Joe. So what they're jealous of is what Joe has been able to get, mainly with his money. And they have that conversation the first time they see Janie. It immediately becomes a conversation about, oh, I'm going to go to town and get a woman like that. No, you can't. You don't have that kind of money. And, the sad truth of the matter is, all you have to do is go to a Rockets game and look at the beautiful women sitting in the front and look to see how old their husbands are, or their husbands probably aren't very attractive, but I guarantee you they're rich. So yeah, it does still happen. But I think that women find out um, through this experience that it, the lifestyle may seem great, but when you don't have any self-worth and value of your own, it doesn't matter how beautiful you look or what you put on. You're going to feel less of a human being, and that's what she starts to feel like. So, speaking of the no voice, it starts at that speech, which I've mentioned before, but we'll look at this um, as she writes it, because he gives a speech and somebody says, "Hey, well, now let's hear from the mayor's wife, Mrs. Sharks." Janie made a face, laugh after a short pause. But it wasn't too easy. She had never thought of making a speech and didn't know if she cared to make one at all. It must have been the way Joe spoke out without giving her a chance to say anything, one way or another, that took the bloom off of things. But anyway, she went down to the road behind him that night, feeling cold. He strode along invested with a new dignity, thought and planned out loud, unconscious of her thoughts. I just had this thought, so I'm going to throw it out there. But in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, this is an essay that Virginia Woolf wrote about the question as to why there wasn't more women writers. And she goes into a very long kind of narrative about it and gives examples and analogies. But one of the things that she says about men being superior, how are they able to continue to make laws and do all these things if they don't see themselves twice the size? And we'll go back to that in a different scene. But I want you to remember that if they look in the mirror in their reflection of themselves, let's say the woman, he has to look bigger and usually physically. You know, the person who looks the biggest does naturally seem to have a little more throwing their weight around, right? And then, than a real little person, petite person. Except for like kings and stuff and people like Napoleon. But anyways, that's a whole different complex. But they can only do that though if the women allow them as well. And this is why, they at this time especially were very careful about keeping women in their place. Because I mean, you're married to someone long enough, you got to know that this woman is pretty smart. I mean, she's going to end up talking back at some point, and you're going to have to like, whoa, where did that come from? But there is a point where Janie says later on in chapter 6, that we women folks can think too. And he says, no, you can't. You just think you're thinking. And I really do believe that was the way people thought for a long time. It had to be, because otherwise women would have been taken much more seriously than they were for years. And it's really only within this new generation, I think, that it's even in the 80s when you look at movies and you still see women, they're just like, hey babe, hey this, they're not like really seen as equal human beings, especially in the 70s. But in the 80s, still 90, it's starting to get there. And now, of course, we're like, what is it? It's Time's Up. That's it. It's Helen Reddy was kind of before time when she's saying, I am woman, hear me roar, with numbers too big to ignore. She had a real nasally voice. Anyways, so now we have Janie. I'm going to go back to her isolation. By making her superior to other women, now she also has to face the jealousy and the envy, and it's not really in Janie's nature to be that way. She wants to sit on the porch and talk, and I'm going to get to the mule story in a minute that it says she came up with some stories too for the mule. And Hurston used mules a lot. I think you'll see why in a little bit, because of how it's very symbolic to demonstrating oppression. But let me just read this part. Janie soon began to feel the impact of all and envy against her sensibilities. The wife of the mayor was not just another woman, as she had supposed. She slept with authority, and so she was part of it in the town's mind. She couldn't get but so close to most of them in spirit. It was especially noticeable after Joe had forced through a town ditch to drain the street in front store, and they had murmured hotly about slavery being over, but every man filled his assignment. There was something about Joe Sharks that cowed the town. It was not because of physical fear. He was no fist fighter. His bulk was not even imposing as men go. Neither was it because he was more literate than the rest. Something else made men give way before him. He had a bow-down command in his face, and every step he took made the thing more tangible. And, that big voice, which she and says the rest of the town looked like servants surrounded by there's the big house. And of course he says he wants to be a big voice. But he starts off with money that other people don't have, and he has the know-how. He knows it's going to be like the same as somebody who's able to buy a bunch of real estate, and then they buy a bunch of hotels, and then, it just escalates. Well, most people don't do that because they don't ever have that kind of capital to ever do something like that to begin with. So the way that he starts to also just distinguish himself from others, though, is sort of a class thing. Even the spit cup that he gives Janie, some people would have used that as decor, and she's spitting in this pretty flowery cup. Like what a waste. Most people just spit on their floor, but they didn't have to, and it seems so silly in a way, but that's basically the little things that distinguish us. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when I'm stopping at a four-way stop, I always feel like the person who's going to go first is not really the person who stopped. A lot of times it's the person who's driving the nicest car, like the Mercedes, or someone goes first. And it could be my imagination, but I swear I think that sometimes people feel like they have more, they're entitled because they have more things. And people immediately feel that way too. And because of that, then it happens. So anyways, that's just kind of an observation about what does money, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are in high school and you can see this. What makes someone popular? I mean, what makes someone really unpopular? Someone could have a great personality, but maybe they can't afford good clothes. That was like me in high school, but in, elementary school and all my life. And the thing is you have to learn how to really have a personality. But what is it about the people who have the nicest stuff that immediately makes them better than everyone else? It's just stuff. It doesn't mean anything. They didn't do anything to deserve it. They were born into it. People will say, "Oh yeah, well they earned it." Not necessarily. That's not always true. It's not the case, but it is something about our human nature, and I think it's got maybe something to do with greed or whatever that makes us want to possess things and to look envious upon those who do have things. And if you get very comfortable, not that you shouldn't want to be successful, but if you get very comfortable with and very grateful for everything that you have, the less that becomes attractive, and you can start to kind of see through it, and it's not really that big of a deal. So she's distinguishing herself. The women are seeing her the way she puts it. It was bad enough for white people, but when one of your own color could be so different, it put you on a wonder. It was like seeing your sister turn into a gator, a familiar strangeness. You keep seeing your sister in the gator and the gator in your sister, and you'd rather not. So it's isolating her and separating her from everybody else. At one point, when she's wanting to talk the porch about the mule, and he sits there and he listens to it and he laughs, but he always acts like with Janie that these people should be more ambitious. They shouldn't want to just laugh and enjoy life all the time. This is why they stay exactly where they stay. And Janie, this is just part of being human and having that connection with other people. And isolating her keeps, especially when the only person she can be around is Joe, really. And Joe is not real good company, so she is very lonely, which is something that naturally kind of happens to people who end up being on top. They say it's lonely on top. So let's get to the mule. The mule is, first of all, just a running gag, and I think she uses mule stories also because they came up in folklore, and they were just important to the community. They were important for farming. And so, but there's this one guy, he has a real mean mule, and from what the other people say, it doesn't sound like he feeds them very well. So they're making fun of him, but they're also making fun of his mule, and they're coming up with these stories to really irritate him. And so I'm going to get more into that in chapter 6, trying to see what else. And the mule is going to represent kind of an analogy of oppression. But so we're going to get to chapter 6. But the last thing, I want you to go back to that idea that all he done was make off from the rest of us. He didn't have all this before he came. And so, for the AP test, if you're thinking about writing about this book, which I'm sure if you're going through all this trouble, you probably are, think about memorizing a few lines and maybe making yourself kind of, as you study, some key literary terms that you would know that you would want to talk about. You'd have to talk about point of view or maybe personification. You got to have that literary side. You got to have your themes maybe on a note card. The other thing is, though, you want some key passages. I did this with The Great Gatsby too. There's some key quotes that if you memorize that quote, you could talk about the entire novel as a whole. So no matter what the question is, if you find a way to get that quote in there, and it's easier to write about something when you have something to analyze in front of you. So even if it's just a quote, it'll help you be able to think faster about what you're trying to say, and its specific support. So it's just all around a must. Okay, so this is really important. The town had a basket full of feelings, good and bad, about Joe's positions and possessions, but none of them had the temerity to challenge him. They bowed down to him rather because he was all of these things, and then again he was all these things because the town bowed down.